If you want to read better and think more clearly and understand the ideas shaping our world, then this might be for you. You should join the Dr. John Patrick Book Club. It's a private online community where we read great books together and learn how to think, not just what to think. Inside, you're going to have access to Dr. John Patrick as we work through books and ask questions. If you've ever felt like there are books you should be reading or ideas that you want to understand better, but you didn't want to do it alone, this is a good place to start. You can find the link in the show notes or the description below to join.
Hello, everyone. Here it's a beautiful morning of summer as the hay is being bound, ready to be carted around for the various animals that will be eating it over the winter. It's a lovely time of year. Every day you go out, there's something fresh to look at. And that is what made me start thinking about how we come to treasure the things we do. I wasn't overly happy with the way I dealt last week with that lovely book by Michael Bonner, but we'll come back to that both today and in the future. But one of the other things that's very interesting to me at the moment is, without any doubt, there is a revival of interest in what people at the moment probably often call spirituality, not quite knowing what they're looking for. It's also different in different parts of the world and different between men and women in different parts of the world. All of these features are interesting. One of the ways it's happening in much of the Islamic world anyway is, but not just there, is that people are meeting Jesus in dreams. I've always been a bit suspicious of these things, but one can't deny what's happening when most of the mosques in Iran are closed, and even Islamic demographics, which they always boast about, are actually and have been falling steadily for the last 20 years. They are not guaranteed a reproductive advantage in the future, except in very, very poor places. And quite clearly, the selfish Western world is going to decide only to let in people who are useful to them. That, of course, is another whole subject. But I'm not quite sure whether it was a dream or half awake last night. I found myself thinking about my upbringing and the blessings of poverty, if you like. What happens in the first few years of life is, of course, astonishing. And humans are quite different from any other animal. We're the only word-based, what was I going to say, culture, and that's true, but the animals don't think in terms of culture. They're driven by instinct, and they don't have language. They have signaling methods, yes, but they don't have language and no nuance. Yet we are born, and within no time at all, really, we acquire a language without any formal training. And if a child isn't doing something well in that area, within a very short time, we start looking for reasons. And children relate to their parents with a smile by 6 weeks. They're making all sorts of important connections. We don't build on them in the way we should. Animals, just instincts. Us, language. And as John Lennox is very, what's the word I want, consistent in saying, everything, mathematics, science, is all language-based. When I went to university, the idea that biology could be language-based was non-existent, but DNA has changed that completely. DNA is an incredibly sophisticated language. It's not what it makes. It's the best analogy, actually, is a blueprint library. And the language is so sophisticated. I mean, could you imagine a language that leads only 4 letters and writes in 3-letter words, is coded in every cell in the body, can reproduce itself, and not only does it do so, it checks the errors, and almost certainly the so-called errors of single nucleotide polymorphisms are not errors at all, but a building in a flexibility in the background. The whole thing is incredible, mind-boggling, absolutely impossible by chance. Same thing happening in both quantum physics and in astronomy. The world is incredibly sophisticated, and at its heart is language. And we learn that language without training, and when we do it by training, we do less well, don't we? If a child is brought up where 3 languages are spoken around them all the while, they will speak 3 languages. Even when they don't do very well at school later on. So actually it's quite a gift to move your children around in those first few years so that they're exposed to other cultures. I'm going to be fascinated. One of my grandsons has been transported from Canada to the Czech Republic before he's speaking. He's going to speak fluently in Czech and in English. His parents won't speak fluently in Czech, nor an easy language, but for him it'll be no problem. That's an astonishing phenomenon. This is another version of tacit knowledge. I often refer to Polanyi and Newbegin and tacit knowledge, the things we know without knowing how we know them, but we know them for sure. We don't know how we learnt our languages, but we know when we've got it right. And the children pick up nuances very quickly. They speak grammatically, if their parents speak grammatically, but they have the family grammar anyway. And that's tacit knowledge. They know it without thinking about it. AI doesn't come close to that. It's powerful, but it's entirely different. And I started, well, I don't know, as I said, I'm not quite sure whether I was half awake or half asleep, I'm not sure, but I started thinking about my own family, and it was reinforced later this morning when I got up and I drifted into a YouTube discussion of John Lennox with a guy whose name I've already forgotten, and I couldn't find it again when I went back looking at a black guy, obviously highly intelligent, agnostic but interested, and he found exactly the right person to talk to in John Lennox. So it's a lovely video. I have to go and search for it later. But John Lennox talks about his early childhood, which was similar to mine in many ways, except that his parents were much better educated than mine. Mine had no school education beyond a couple of years of post-elementary education, but they were both highly intelligent. And I started to think about the fact that what had I acquired from these 2 uneducated but loving parents? I only ever heard them argue volubly once in my life. I'm sure they did more on occasions, but that's all I ever heard. I only remember corporal punishment once from my mother when I lied as a little boy, and I discovered on that day that in this family, lying is not a good idea. Better to tell the truth, even when you've done something wrong. There was a passion in her that she wanted to make sure I understood that lying was not acceptable. What a wonderful gift to give a child. Imprinted very early. Then I started thinking a bit more. What were the influences in my life for which I should be giving thanks? This is especially so because culture and society are bothering me a lot at the moment. But I began to realize I could probably write an essay on the blessings of poverty because we were poor. I didn't know we were poor, but we were poor. And John Lennox's family sounds as though it was somewhat similar. Rich in love and rich in caring for one another and encouraging our abilities and modelled well. My mother and father looked after other people as well, even though they didn't have much. The first thing they did was set aside 10% for the church and to give away. And I took that as well. That's what normal, decent people do. Of course, yes, to some extent that's true, but not entirely. Not at all entirely. You know, you see it all the while. I mean, it's quite clear now that Mandani, who lived an incredibly wealthy life in Uganda, lied about his wealth in New York and lived in subsidized housing. He's incredibly wealthy. And obviously, he wouldn't feel any guilt about it because people get what they deserve in most cultures. And so if you get a chance to enrich yourself, then come your way, take it. And of course, in a Darwinian world, there'd be no question. You do. The only ethics that could come out of that reductive view of the world is you do what advantages your genes. I never saw that happen. And of course, from 6 weeks of age, I went to church every Sunday. That my parents walked to church, and my mother would leave the pram by the window that she could sit by. She could see me while being in church all Sunday morning. And I went to church every Sunday unless I was approaching death until I went to university. And it was a brethren church. So the most important thing was the amount of scripture that was read. And I didn't know it, but at that time my mind was receptive and God had given me a very good memory. And I now realize that over the years, having the Bible read to me every day, at least twice, and on Sunday, it was continuous Bible. Going to Sunday school, where my mother taught every Sunday. 3 times on Sunday I went to church. And that was the norm. So the biblical norms and the biblical messages, like you can't read the Bible that much and not realize that the world is morally consequential. People who do bad things, they get punished. There are problems when the Jews disobey, there will be punishment, serious one. But there is forgiveness the covenant holds. So I learned moral consequence. As I pointed out, I learned that truth was very important. We had no external stimulus other than the radio, which was very good in those days. So even growing up, I discovered BBC Three, which was now no longer happening. There's nothing equivalent to it. It apparently served only about 100,000 people. But I stumbled across it quite early on, and I love to listen to these. I think it was 4 guys, professors, and people wrote in with questions that they hoped would stump them. And so you heard these 4 very erudite guys talking to one another and discussing the question, and so many odds and ends came out that were interesting, that got stowed away in my mind. But above all, a recognition, wow, they really enjoy knowing things. And even that strange English game cricket where when there was a test match on, which goes on for 5 days from 11 in the morning till 6 at night, my mother liked to, when she was doing an ironing, she would like to listen to the cricket commentary, which was much better in those days than it is now, because they did have ex-cricketers doing it, but primarily they had people who loved the game, knew the game, but were erudite. So the commentaries would, if the game was a bit slow, you'd learn all sorts of odds and ends that Swanton and it's the one I remembered. But there were three or four of them, and I've got on my shelf somewhere a book of the essays of one. That they were fun to listen to. So I was acquiring an enjoyment of learning without even knowing that that's what I was doing. That's tacit knowledge of the best way. We never had a television, so that never destroyed my capacity for a sustained argument as it does now. I mean, students today have a concentration span which is negligible. I mean, it's not sufficient for proper education. I could go to the library later on when I was a student, and 5 hours would pass by and I wouldn't even look at the time. That's how long I could go on reading for. The kids are looking at their phone every few minutes. There's no sustained engagement with a topic. So they never actually get to the point where they learn anything. It's just memorize and dump. As more than one listener to this podcast has written to tell me, that nailed it for me. That's what's happening. Memorizing and dumping and no education. True. How does that change? Again, even what are taken at first sight as, what should I say, suffering, at really too hard a word to use. But I was had some sort of illness which upset my mother, and I was seen by the doctor, who actually referred me to the hospital, and they made a false diagnosis. Somebody who got quite good ears heard a murmur from my heart. And so the norm at my age then, sort of being around 5, I guess, somewhere around there, just gone to primary school, and I don't think I finished first year, and then was off for several months because they diagnosed rheumatic fever, which it wasn't. But I didn't discover that till I was in my 40s. But the only treatment was to stay in bed for several weeks to over a month anyway. So my mother had to keep this little boy occupied. So she taught me to read. She taught several people along during our lifetime how to read. When the school had failed, she could get them to learn. She would have been an incredible teacher. She was an incredible Sunday school teacher. I mean, there's a Canadian young woman I met not so long ago who credited my mother's Sunday school with giving her life the direction it had. That was the last thing she understood before she disappeared into Alzheimer's. A lovely exit, so to speak. So I started reading. By the time I went back to school, I don't know, I was several grades higher than I should be reading, and I never stopped. So for years, I read at least one book a week unrelated to what was going on at school, even in medical school. That's an incredible gift. It doesn't come naturally, but if you get into that habit, if you're drawn into that habit in the right way when you're young, and there's somebody around who is smart enough to give you the sort of books that push you on a little further. There were 2 nurses that my mother got to know when she went to hospital to have me, because I was a placenta previa baby, and so I had to be delivered by cesarean section when the time came. So she spent some time in hospital and got to know a couple of nurses who were Christian, and then they were both from outside Birmingham, just doing their training in Birmingham, and they would come to visit my mother in their time off. And one of them, who never married, realized that I was reading stuff and that was ahead of my time. So she started, every Christmas and birthday, I would get a book that pushed me on much further than I'd been before. Aunt Edna, yeah. She played a role in my life, which I never really thought about till she passed on, but she will get her reward in heaven. But that meant I knew a lot of literature. I never in high school came across a book that we had to read that I hadn't already read pretty well. Occasionally, and they were usually ones that were at the end of the spectrum that I think would be better off not in the English program. But there wasn't much like that in those days. So that was another form of knowledge without even thinking about it. This is what you do to your children when you read the Bible to them, and you don't spend a lot of time making sure they understand at the time, because particularly in the first 5 years, understanding is not something that comes to them. They take it all in, and you should be very careful what they're taking in. Not having a television is the first step forward. Put a television in your bedroom if you must have one, but don't let it dominate the living space, because it's dangerous for your children. The ads are more subtle than the programming. That's their problem. You can remember the ads that ran on television when you were in elementary school. They don't do that because it doesn't work. They do it because it does work. But do you want a mind that's furnished with advertising? I hope not. So we didn't have a television. Another benefit of poverty. And the fact that the church was central to our lives, and children know when their parents are doing something that matters to them, even if they don't understand it, it interests them. So again, my mother, realizing once I got big enough to be in church, that I needed to have some means of, what shall I say, dealing with the bits of church which are less profitable than others. She had an exercise book, and she just said, copy out a psalm. So one of the things that would happen, apparently, I don't know this, pretty well every Sunday, is I would copy out a psalm into this book. I don't know where it went. It got lost. But what a gift to have the Psalms at the back of your life, because that's what they are. I mean, they are food for the soul. I mean, Psalm 1, to have that imprinted on your mind. I won't have anything to do with evildoers. I won't sit with the scornful. I'll keep the scriptures in the middle of my life, and then I will be like a tree growing beside a stream and producing fruit. Whereas those who don't do that, they're going to be blown around all over the place. And see, having that story imprinted in your mind early in life, you can't imagine these things now. I didn't do as good a job with my children as my father did with me and my mother. My mother was the one who read the scriptures to me. But I watched my parents, and the church was central to their lives. And it was a supportive environment. They looked after one another. They cared for one another. They cared for their neighbors. They were kind. That's so important. So in thinking about the poverty, I mean, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. But Luke says, blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And I realized, yeah, he's right. If those poor people love God, the poverty is not such a big problem. In fact, in the modern world, it might well do you a lot of good. I don't know. Clearly, our education system is not doing what it used to do. So in elementary school, the Bible was read every day, first thing at school. When I went to high school, a private school that was called a public school, such are the quirks of the English language, one of the best schools in England. There too, every day began with what should have been called a chapel service, a reading from the Bible, a hymn, a prayer, and if necessary, a mini sermon from the chief master, as he was called. never called the headmaster there for some reason. The school had been around for 400 years, so it had a few traditions, and they were good because they were rooted in Christian belief. It was one of many schools that Edward the Sixth founded. He didn't live very long, and he was a very ardent Reformed Christian, even though he was head of the Anglican Church. And he founded schools all over England as a Christian activity. Tolkien was one of the recipients of the education that I also got. And there were everybody in my class went on to university. That's what the school was like. Those schools have really, really made a difference because there was a love of learning, and it didn't need money. We are too distracted these days, and especially you need to find ways to get your children to increase their concentration span and to begin to understand the difference between real literature and trashy literature. Reading the Bible does that. At the back of your mind, there's a standard of what literature should be like. Isn't it amazing that our Lord never wrote anything except in the sand, but his stories are known and repeated around the world? Because he knew how to do narrative. Of course he did. He could draw any audience in, quite obviously. I imagine that when he went preaching in the villages, they would beg him to go on, and usually he went on for at least an hour, I would think, probably more than that on most occasions. I look forward one day to meeting some of those people who actually listen to him for real. I would love to hear what they're made of it. I think The Chosen has done very well in imagining what that might be like. And of course, in England, where the Bible was in school and until still in school now, but not adequately, because of multiculturalism, one day you get Hindu writing and another Muslim and Christianity, all treated as though they're equally useful or useless. That used not to be the case, and in North America too, until the stupidity of removing the Bible from school happened in the 60s. So that a minority understanding of what is good coming from people who were half-educated and disrespectful of their own history has done immense damage. But you can't, if you're going to be serious about English literature, you have got to know the Bible, because the metaphors of good literature are vital to understand. We had one woman professor in Ottawa, who an ardent, rigorous feminist of the more malicious variety, and she did some work on the widows' mite societies of the East Coast. She was interested in them as she didn't see the title as important. She saw them as women showing their independence and doing things together, which they did. She got an award actually, but she didn't know what the widow's mite meant. One of the students who used to sit in on our prof's breakfast actually managed to get a question in that made it clear that she had no idea what the widow's mite was. She didn't know the story of the widow's mite. So she didn't understand that this woman's greatest and most important motivation for her was to do as much as she could to obey the law. And so she gave the widow's mite the smallest amount of money that was acceptable. How the mighty fallen when our elites no longer know the stories behind their own language. Even the games we played, I loved games that involved memory, like Happy Families and the like. But we had several biblical versions. So the questions, for instance, would be from a given book, and somebody who was reading the question, there would be something like 5 questions. And through those cards, I knew them all by heart, of course, very shortly. So nobody could beat me at that. I knew from the first obscure version quite soon because I was competitive in that kind of way. But what a wonderful thing to happen. All the Jungle Doctor books which passed my way, and multiple other books that were written for children, but without dumbing down. You don't dumb down to children. That's nonsense. You only have to look at the way the Narnia stories are understood by children before they're 10 years old at that level. As soon as they're into real stories, they will listen to the Narnia stories. I read the Narnia stories to all my children, and I didn't tell them what they meant. They were just good stories from their point of view. And my oldest daughter didn't work out that Aslan was Jesus until the last bit of the last book in the Narnia series, and when who is it now? I've got name block. Isn't that terrible? I really am reaching the end of this stretch. But at the end, one of the children, Lucy, sees the dwarfs arguing in a stable and not being able to realize what was outside. Their world was in a stable. Their whole world was in a stable. And then she suddenly realized our world was in a stable once. Aslan is Jesus. What a lovely way to put it together. Quite sophisticated, actually. But not until the last book. You remember those things. In Africa, we read the Narnia stories when my children were all in high school or university. High school, actually. Together again, and it was such fun. My children would go canoeing, and they discovered, as a family, that Shakespeare plays work very well around a campfire. Great to have that put into your mind too. I grew up riding my bike, which is my father had put together from scrap, but I could ride to Stratford and back, which was 20 miles away, 25 miles away, all through Shakespeare country, where he was born, where he lived. It soaked into my soul. And of course, Worcestershire, which was the county that I went through to get to Stratford from Birmingham, was where Tolkien got his ideas, particularly for Sam the gardener. He's a Worcestershire gardener. That neighborhood was all in my mind, and it helped. I mean, John O'Gaunt's wonderful eulogy, it was a eulogy now, but a meditation on why England was so blessed. I knew that by heart at one point. I should brush it up and get it back. The best, what's the word I want? It's not bragging. It's just being grateful for the things that made England great. I mean, common law being one of them, of course, which most people don't realize, is very old. It goes back to Alfred and his sons. But that's where the jury system arose, which many of the liberal elite want to get rid of so that they can have their carefully chosen, politically correct idiots telling us all how we ought to live. That one of the problems with modern electronics and computing is that they know far too much about us, and we need to make sure they don't start peering even further. Nothing will stop them, though, as far as I can see, other than switching off the machines for a lot of the time. So, my world growing up, I was never anxious. I had a totally supportive and trustworthy environment. I loved learning. I didn't know that you could get neurotic about it, particularly when neurotic parents. I mean, I really feel for Asian students on the whole whose parents are so demanding that they take away all joy in learning, and it's all about marks, grades. They don't matter. I never revised for exams because nobody told me you had to. I carried one book around, a notebook, wrote things in that. I didn't write anything down very much in elementary school because I could remember it all. That sets you free in such a wonderful way. If I had my way, I would reduce university entrance to 5% of the population, which is what it was when I went, because they can do it with joy. If an education system makes you anxious and neurotic, something's gone wrong. We should do a lot more teaching by apprenticeship programs. Medicine could be taught entirely on an apprenticeship program. I've had at least 3 students over the years, very bright, all of whom I would have said, working for an appropriate person, I would trust you to take histories and make the first step within 6 weeks of getting you going. And you'll be very good at clinical medicine. You can go and look things up in the library as they come along. You'll learn that way, and it will be fixed permanently because it'll be related to something that matters to you. I mean, I've got a few friends now. I live in the country. One who's cutting the hay this year, and he has an old tractor, and yesterday it stopped. Starter problem. And he knew what it was. He got a hammer and he banged on the side of the engine at the right place, he said, and kept trying it, and then it started. But in the process, he learned exactly which connection it was that was a bit loose, and banging it around made it enough of a question to get a spark to get it going. And once it was going, of course, it didn't need the starter motor anymore. But he could describe, he knew roughly where it was. He hadn't got the time yet to get to that point in the engine and make the connections secure again. It's the same with medicine, isn't it, those of you doctors? Sometimes you know what's wrong with a patient before they say more than a few words, sometimes without any words. And it's intuitive, it's tacit knowledge. Knowing what that sound means. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that one of the things that's bothering me is the differential cultural change between men and women in the university. Have I got time to do this? Yes, I do, just about. It's bothering me a lot. It's quite clear that girls going to university, they've got something like a 30% probability of having serious outbreaks of anxiety at some point. The guys run around 10%. There shouldn't be any anxiety, really. I mean, I would tell students every year, look, now you're in medical school, you're going to pass unless you get into bad habits. That's the only reason. Moral turpitude, and since they can't define moral turpitude, the only things that's going to get you into trouble are politically incorrect behavior. So just be careful about that. But don't worry about the course, especially now that so much of it is irrelevant. I mean, biochemistry doesn't translate directly into medicine very much. Not like physiology, where you can sort of think of it as by analogy of the machine. And it doesn't matter. Doctors, by and large, don't know the intermediary metabolism of energy within the body. They don't need to. They do diabetes basically by recipe approach, and that's fine. It works. Evidence-based medicine is just patting yourself on the back to say that you've read the literature and you know it. That's nonsense. It's not evidence-based medicine. It's authority-based medicine. Instead of the authority being someone who you can watch dealing with a patient and therefore make some judgments that are perfectly valid, tacit judgments of who you trust and who you don't. Now you have to go and find a paper by somebody who's famous, who's published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and that is evident. Well, the John Darcy affair makes it quite clear. That was one of the first major evidence fabrication, cheating that occurred in the New England Journal of Medicine many years ago. Oh. Unless you can read the methods section of a scientific paper, it's authority, not evidence. The only way you can really take a paper apart and be critical is if you can say, well, they misused the methodology. That methodology cannot produce that level of precision. They're cheating. You can do that if you know the methods at that level. But you can sometimes find, well, frequently now, you can find logical errors. The correlation causation error occurs all the while, and it's causing all sorts of damage. We have got a lot of work to do. So the women get more anxious than the men do. Something to do with our genetic and metabolic differences. That's quite clear, isn't it? I mean, Jonathan Haidt's work makes it quite clear that boys need adventure playgrounds that girls don't need in the same way. A guy has to do things that have some risk attached. But then one of the amazing things about my father, once I started wanting to go further on my bike and I found out about the youth hostel system, against my mother's will, he said, no, he's a sensible kid, and Dennis, who's going with him, is also sensible. They'll be fine. And so our first trip was Oxford and back with a couple of nights away in youth hostels. Then it got to long weekends and then weeks and eventually a month on the continent every year. And the only requirement was a postcard every day, which in England would get there within 24 hours, and from the continent, a day or two. What a different world. But of course, in immediately post-war England and Europe, there was no risk to children, and riding a bike on the road, the traffic was not heavy. Everywhere was recovering. But I got to Venice and Vienna and all around the Low Countries and the Black Forest and the Rhine Valley and Switzerland. I went over the Alps twice on a bike. That's a different world. Now we have all this anxiety and helicopter parenting who can watch their children all the while. Where are they? That doesn't tell you what they're doing. They're smart enough to make sure their phones only show what they want you to see. At least you can know where they are. We didn't even have a telephone while I was at home. We got one after I went to university, but we didn't have one before that. But they didn't worry because it was safe. What's happening in Denmark at the moment is worth looking at, because Denmark was a high-trust society. And that's why they could run a very extensive social welfare system, because the Danes didn't exploit it. They were proud of it, and they used it cautiously, so it remained fundable. Then they allowed all the immigrants in, and they abused it. Now Denmark has said, enough. You can come, but you cannot set about trying to change our high-trust culture for your low-trust culture. Muslim societies are a loyalty over truth society, as are pagan societies. Judeo-Christian societies at their best were truth over loyalty. That's not a small difference. So the Danes have done something which you could not have believed. A left-wing government has done it, saying you cannot proselytize in school. You cannot demand that your religion be represented in school. They don't understand the centrality of the Bible yet, but they say, like the French, that it's got to be secular. But secular in the Western world has to draw its values from somewhere. And its values really, of course, were its ethics. And where we got them from was the Bible. And although the French and the Danes don't recognize that, that's where it came from. It's more explicitly understood by the more thoughtful people in the West. America was a Protestant foundation. And even Ben Franklin famously said, when somebody said we should pray at the start of the Philadelphia plans to get rid of the British, he said, because if we don't pray together, we'll certainly swing together. And their main concern was deeply biblical, because they were mainly concerned to set up a constitution that would recognize the truths that I learned from the Bible and they had learned from the Bible, that we are created in the image of God, but we have fallen. God told us we were going to fall flat on our face, but we would learn in the process, something to do with the sort of people he wants in heaven. So we know what good and evil are. We don't want liberals telling us what good and evil are. We have a better system that's worked for hundreds of years, thousands of years for the Jews, thousands for us too, actually, and led to a stable, hard-working, honest society, respectful of honesty, even when they knew. We all sin, don't we? The good that I would, I do not. The evil that I would not, that I do. That's Paul. It's not a pre-conversion thing that disappeared when he became a Christian. He says at the end of his life, I do not count myself to have got my hands on it, to grasp it, but I press on to the mark of the calling of God. Yeah. That's those insights. Last week I was talking about Michael Bonner's book, At the End of Liberalism, because the liberals take those ideas. He puts them in a slightly different way. But created creatures, that's important because it gives transcendence, created by a God who's interested in us, loves us, and will punish. He's built moral consequence into the system as long as we stay close to his rules. We know when we do right and wrong. We have conscience. The animals don't. They have instincts. Those ideas have gone. The students don't have them. You don't even hear them talk about in church, do you? When did you ever hear a sermon in church that talked about sexuality, including honest outcome analysis? That's the question you always ask. If we allow this, what are the consequences? I'm glad to see that there's a move towards looking at outcomes, including moral outcomes. What kind of society do we want to be? Libertarian sexuality is unhealthy. You get more disease, you die younger, and you do not maintain relationships well. That's 3 bad things to have in your life. So I hope this particular morning, oh dear, gone on longer than I like to, will stimulate you to start thinking about these things a little more. Do read Michael Bonner's book, and do start thinking about the way you can structure your family and your church to be more deeply concerned about the mind. Paul doesn't care about how you feel. God looks after that, and he can make you feel joyful. Indeed, he can make you feel overwhelmingly joyful with a sense of his presence when you're being martyred. That's what led to the church's growth. No, it's not about feeling. It's about training your mind to make your soul one that's orientated towards God's law. Blessings on you all.